Ears first, her last moments were nothing like anyone imagined. The neighbors called it quiet, the police called it clean, and yet the truth was hidden in shadows, frozen by fear and hesitation. The air in her apartment carried the faint scent of coffee and lavender, ordinary in every way, but beneath that calm surface, tension hummed in every corner, unnoticed by anyone, even those who thought they knew her best. Doors clicked softly, footsteps lingered just long enough to matter, and a single misread glance, a hesitation, or a pause would later be remembered as guilt, or worse, intent. The real story behind the murder scene that shocked everyone was never in the blood, the overturned furniture, or the obvious evidence. It lived in the invisible moments, the hesitation, the split-second decisions, the microseconds where life balanced on a knife's edge and the truth refused to fit the neat narrative everyone wanted. A drawer left slightly ajar, a phone left unanswered, a shadow paused mid-step, all became evidence of weakness or guilt in the eyes of observers, when in reality, they were instinctive attempts to survive, to calculate, to protect. Fear hides quietly in plain sight until it is too late. No one could tell the story the way it really happened because stories are always edited by perception. Neighbors remembered her as calm, polite, predictable. The police remembered the scene as methodical, almost too organized. Friends whispered about what they assumed she would do. Every assumption ignored the invisible currents under her actions, the pulses of anxiety that made her freeze, the split-second decisions about whether to move or stay silent, speak or wait. Every hesitation was strategy. Every pause was hope, hope that choices might avoid disaster, even as danger crept closer with every passing second. Think about it. If everything you believed could be wrong, if the person you trusted most acted in ways no one could explain, would you notice the cracks before it was too late, or would you be blindsided like everyone else in this case? Her silence, her hesitation, her fear, they were misinterpreted as guilt, but in reality, they were her armor, her only chance of surviving the moment. The cruel irony is that the very actions designed to protect her story became the evidence that convinced everyone she was already defeated. Even the smallest details were misunderstood. A drawer left slightly open wasn't carelessness, it was a calculated move to divert attention. A phone left unanswered wasn't defiance, it was instinct, a decision to control information until she knew who she could trust. And yet, in the retelling, these minor fragments became proof of intent, misread by those with no access to the fear, the thought, the desperation coursing through her mind. Outside, life carried on. Neighbors returned to their routines, whispered conversations passed in hallways, and the world spun with its distractions. But inside that quiet apartment, tension lingered, thick and unacknowledged, and time did not pause to allow anyone to truly understand her choices. That is the cruelest twist. The story that shocked the world was not the visible struggle, it was the silent misunderstanding of every decision she made under pressure. And now, when you see the title "The Real Story Behind the Murder Scene That Shocked Everyone," understand why the word "real" is not there for drama. It is a warning. What shocked people was not the scene itself, but how completely wrong they were about it. And when you see the words "her last moments," remember, they were rarely loud, rarely heroic, rarely clear. They were tense, conflicted, and full of decisions that outsiders misread completely. Fear does not behave like movies promise. Silence does not look like surrender. Hesitation is not always guilt. Ask yourself honestly, as the shadow of this story lingers in your mind, if someone judged you only by how you acted in your most vulnerable moment, stripped of your history, intentions, and struggles, would the story they tell be true or just convenient? Because in her case, convenience almost killed the truth. And now, as we peel back the layers of what really happened in those final minutes, every assumption you think you've held is about to be challenged. At first, the scene appeared almost disappointingly ordinary, and that ordinariness became its greatest deception. When people arrived that night, they believed they were looking at something already explained, already understood, because the room did not scream chaos, it whispered familiarity. The door was ajar but not violently forced, the windows were locked, and the space felt frozen rather than shattered. Neighbors spoke of quiet, of nothing unusual, of a night that passed without alarm, and those early impressions settled quickly into certainty. Within hours, assumptions hardened into conclusions, and what was visible became the entire truth. Silence was interpreted as confirmation, hesitation as weakness, and fear as intent. The story formed itself neatly, the kind people prefer because it allows them to stop asking questions. A chair sat slightly out of place, easy to dismiss as accidental. Faint marks traced the carpet, too subtle to demand attention. The air conditioner hummed steadily, masking sounds that could no longer be recovered. Each detail existed, but none of them were treated as important, because everyone believed the outline of the crime was already clear. Investigators moved efficiently, neighbors repeated what they thought they had seen or heard, and the public absorbed a version of events that felt complete enough to accept. The room seemed to support that confidence. Nothing appeared frantic. Nothing appeared rushed. And that calmness misled everyone. Because calm does not mean simple. It often means controlled, interrupted, or unfinished. There was a moment, buried deep in the initial review, when one detail did not align with the rest, when something about the layout felt off, not wrong enough to raise alarms, but strange enough to deserve a second look. It was noted briefly, written down, and then quietly set aside because it did not fit the narrative already taking shape. That choice would matter later. At the time, no one thought it would. People rarely do. They trust the first story that makes sense and reshape everything else around it. The chair, the marks, the unanswered phone, the lack of obvious struggle, all of it was folded neatly into an explanation that required no discomfort. What no one accounted for was how fear actually behaves in confined moments, how survival instincts do not announce themselves loudly, and how hesitation can leave traces that only appear meaningful when it is too late. Her last moments were being interpreted through expectation rather than behavior, and expectation won. Even trained eyes are vulnerable to that, especially when the scene feels orderly, especially when the timeline appears short, especially when nothing forces doubt immediately. Outside the apartment, life moved forward without pause. Neighbors returned to routines, conversations softened into gossip, and attention shifted elsewhere. Inside that room, however, the details remained unchanged, waiting for someone willing to see them differently. The way the space was oriented suggested anticipation rather than surrender. The positioning of objects hinted at movement that had been interrupted, not completed. These were not dramatic signs, and that was precisely the problem. They demanded patience instead of reaction. And patience was in short supply. People love certainty, even when it is false, because certainty feels safe. It allows judgment without responsibility. It allows conclusions without consequence. But one assumption in that room would later lock the case into a direction that no one could easily undo. A timeline accepted too early. A behavior misread too quickly. A detail dismissed because it complicated the story. This was not negligence. It was comfort. And comfort can be dangerous. The belief that the case was already understood became a barrier, turning subtle evidence into background noise and freezing the narrative in place. Her silence, her positioning, the lack of visible chaos, all of it was used to support a conclusion that felt clean but rested on fragile ground. What shocked everyone later was not what they missed, but how easily they had missed it. The room had been speaking the entire time, but only to those willing to listen without expectation. And the question that now hangs quietly over everything is this: when the truth does not announce itself loudly, how often do we walk past it, convinced we already know the ending, while the real story waits patiently in the details we chose not to see?